Hi, I'm Shizuko Takahashi, and I didn't have the translation on, so I don't know to what extent that she introduced me, but I'd like to introduce myself. I'm a reproductive endocrinologist, an obstetrician, clinical geneticist, and a bioethicist from Japan. I'm also a mother of 3 young children. Now I've started last year my career as a bioethicist at the National University of Singapore. So some of you have pointed out that in my bio, it's very hard to tell that I am a physician, but I had been practicing for over, close to 20 years now. And I would like to thank you for inviting me to this conference. It's been a really inspiring experience. I'll be presenting my findings from a study that I did about 10 years ago on how Japanese infertile women decide the fate of their frozen embryos, focusing on 2 cultural concepts, mottainai and kuyo. Probably kuyo, some of you may have heard of. The images that you see in these slides are from my children's book on genetics, starting from the embryo, called Becoming You, a Journey from a Single Cell, which I plan to publish in September of 2025, so in a couple months in Japan. This book, my children's book, was inspired through this very study by interviewing mothers who own these frozen embryos. I would like to give you an example of a typical fertility patient. Mrs. B. Mrs. B married Mr. B at 35. After failing to conceive naturally, she began IVF at 38. After several attempts, she was able to freeze 10 embryos. Seeing the embryos gave her a strong sense of already having a child. On the second transfer, she became pregnant, but was hospitalized for threatened miscarriage. But she persevered and she gave birth to a healthy daughter. As she bonded with her daughter, she pondered, what if this embryo wasn't her and it was another embryo? Friends encouraged transferring the frozen embryos, but financial pressure to raise children made having another child uncertain. As the storage limit came close, she had to think about what to do with the leftover embryos. What should she do? So this is a very typical case, I think, happening worldwide. Many are left being unused. These are raising ethical dilemmas to consider what to do with them. For those of you who are not in infertility or fertility treatment or unfamiliar with fertility treatment, I'd like to show you the procedure that usually patients go through. First, one tries fertility drugs to stimulate the ovaries, and we as physicians advise good time for conception. And then if she doesn't get pregnant, then we advise intrauterine insemination, where women is inseminated with sperm manually. And then if pregnancy doesn't happen, then surgery to see what might be the cause of not being able to conceive is done. And finally, if pregnancy doesn't happen, then IVF is decided. So it's really quite a process, not just financially, but physically, emotionally. So it's not an easy process. So here's the process right here. First, the woman is stimulated with hormones so that the ovary will make many eggs. Then the eggs are retrieved with a long needle, usually with some anesthesia. But in Japan, sometimes without. Sperm is retrieved, and the eggs are fertilized. Embryos are grown for either 3 days or 5 days, depending on which clinic that you get treated. Usually there is more than one embryo that is made, and if the uterus is good, deemed good for transfer or ready, then transfer of one embryo usually is done, but the leftover embryos are kept frozen. So if she gets pregnant with just that one transfer, then she has to always decide, keep thinking about what to do with these frozen embryos. So this is another image that I made. So there is a lot of embryos stored worldwide, as you can see. A lot from Japan, because we have the second most frequent cycles in the world after Israel, due to our pronatalist policies. And 1 out of 10 children in Japan born is a product of IVF now. So it's an increasingly used technology. So the storage period of embryos in Japan is until the end of women's reproductive life, which is very vague. So I tell my patients around 45 to 50. It depends on the clinic, really. And the options available for women are 3. 1, to continue storage. 2, to donate to research. 3, to discard. And donation to other couples for reproductive purposes is not in the guidelines of Japan at the moment. And these are some of the factors that affect the decision-making process of embryos. First, the conceptualization of the embryo. And second, the moral status, which is whether the embryo is a person or not. Number 3, the meaning and symbolism of the embryo, what it means. And embryo quality, the higher the grading of the embryos, the better chances of pregnancy. And these are some of the previous models that's been developed in the West in terms of the decision-making process. And first, patients are reassured that they have embryos in storage. And second, they avoid thinking about it. And then third, they're confronted with a choice, and then they make a choice and there's resolution. And if they make a choice for not using their embryos, then they consider donation to others for reproductive purposes. And then if they consider no donation, then they consider donation to science. And so I was wondering, so we don't have this option to donate to another couple. Hasn't been really previous studies on what the decision-making process was like for Japanese patients. So what is the model with 3 options in Japan? So I did a paper about 10 years ago, which is still very relevant, called this right here, the decision-making process for the fate of frozen embryos. And so if you would like to look it up and read it, you can read the details of my study. So what is the process like for Japanese patients like Mrs. B? I was also very particularly interested because I was a resident at the time, and I was in charge of throwing away these embryos or discarding them as medical waste. So I was wondering, what really is it that they're going through? So I sent a letter of recruitment to patients when I sent out the letter of notice that their storage period is over. They could decide to continue storage or donate to research and discard. Some of the institutions in Japan does not have a donate to research option, but at the University of Tokyo, it does. And 31 women agreed to the interview. And as you can see, I was not able to interview many patients who decided to discard, which is the limitation of my study. So how did I analyze these interviews? I used a grounded theory approach, which is one of the qualitative data analysis approaches. And I collected data from the interviews and then built a theory from patterns and ideas that emerged from the interviews instead of like starting with a theory first. And when I came up with a theory, then I did member checking and peer debriefing for credibility of my theories. So this is the decision-making process that I found. So in order to really clearly explain, I have to read off of my script. So this is a 5-step decision-making model. And first, the process often begins with embryo transfer moratorium. This means that before receiving the letter from the clinic about the end of storage period that I had sent with the letter of recruitment, patients often delay making any decision. It's a kind of emotional pause. They are not ready to let go of the possibility of having another child. So after they receive the letter, they enter a phase of emotional and moral reflection. So this is step 2. This is often described in Japan using the term mottainai, a deep cultural value, meaning what a waste. Patients see the embryos not just as medical material, but as a precious potential life. This emotional meaning complicates the decision. They also consider having another child. And then third, they consider the cost of continued storage. About $500 for another 3 years of storage at the University of Tokyo. For some, the expense is manageable and worth for the emotional reinsurance. For others, it became the tipping point to consider discontinuing storage. Fourth, the partner's opinion becomes crucial. While women often feel a strong attachment to the embryos, partners may approach the decision more pragmatically. They seemed, at least from the interviews, they were distant and often left to the woman to decide. This process led to difficult conversations and sometimes big disagreements, and some divorce cases because of that. But in Japan, if you divorce, then you cannot use the embryos. Finally, if they choose to end storage, they must decide between discarding the embryos or donating them to research. Interestingly, many prefer donation not necessarily out of scientific interest, but because it helped relieve the guilt of wasting embryos, again, tied to mottainai value. So the model is not just about medical or financial logic. It's deeply emotional and culturally shaped. At its heart was the underlying theme, which I have on the side: how do I come to terms with infertility? It reflected how patients try to come to terms with infertility, loss, and the potential of becoming a mother of another child. So for those who continued storage, it was they can postpone or deny acceptance of infertility. Those who decided to discontinue was an acceptance of infertility. So today, for the sake of time, I want to focus on step 2, considering the mottainai embryo with having another child. Before I explain the patient's decision, I want to introduce a word that became central to how she described her decision-making process, mottainai. It is a Japanese word with layered meanings. It can express something impious or sacrilegious as a violating something sacred, the sense that something is more than one deserves. And most commonly, it refers to wastefulness, to waste something that still has value. It was used by an environmentalist, Ungali Maitai, was from Africa, Nobel Prize winner. So mottainai became quite a famous word after she used it, thanks to her. But mottainai is more than just about waste. It carries a sense of sadness and guilt, a moral discomfort. When something valuable is treated carelessly or discarded before its time. In the context of embryo decision-making, this word allowed patients to express a deep and ethical tension. As you'll see, it wasn't just about utility or cost. It was about respect for possibility, for life, and for one's own past efforts. In the interviews, patients spoke with striking honesty about the emotional and moral burden they felt when facing the decision to dispose of frozen embryos. For those who thought that the embryo was worthy of transfer and storage, claimed 3 reasons. They could not bear the burden of disposal, saw the embryos as siblings of an existing child, and therefore presumed to have high pregnancy potential, grateful that this technology existed, acknowledging that the embryos had been created with great effort. But with that came a sense of responsibility. They were created and disposed from the parental ego. It is too mottainai that not returning it to where it belongs, the womb, will leave me guilty as if I had an abortion. This quote captures the heart of mottainai experience. The idea that disposing the embryos without giving them a chance to be born is a waste of life, effort, and intention. It is not just practical waste, it's moral waste and carries guilt. This emotional weight often led patients to reconsider having another child, not necessarily out of desire, but as a way to resolve the guilt and fulfill what they saw as embryo's purpose. So here, mottainai isn't just a cultural saying, it becomes an emotional and ethical force, deeply embedded in how people understand their responsibilities to their embryos. On the other hand, the embryo was not worthy of transfer and storage because they were reluctant at having embryos in storage, or they thought they were discomforted by the unnaturalness of the freezing process itself. One woman reflected, freezing, thawing, and returning it, the entire process so abnormal and unnatural. Sometimes they gave me an example of like a frozen tuna, and when you defrost it, it just doesn't taste as good as before. This view reframes the embryo not as a potential child to be cherished, but as a product of medical process, something that contrasts with natural family making. Even when patients felt the embryos were mottainai, they questioned whether they should be used in this artificial way. The idea that embryo was mottainai, too valuable to waste, came also the thinking about whether another child was desired. And this depended on 3 factors. If she felt that the family didn't feel complete, her experience with IVF had been a good one, especially with ongoing support from the family, and she felt that embryo transfer was the only real way that she could get pregnant again. When she put all this together, the embryo started to feel different. It wasn't just leftover material, it became a possible sibling, a last chance, something hard to throw away. So they go back and forth thinking about the mottainai embryo, having another child, mottainai embryo. On the other hand, patients who did not desire another child, even when they had frozen egg embryos remaining, there were 3 reasons for this. Family planning was already fulfilled. Many participants felt their family was complete and they had no intention of expanding it further. The IVF experience was perceived as negative, emotionally and physically draining. Some described the process as invasive and stressful, and they weren't willing to go through it again. Lastly, some patients preferred the natural pregnancy over medical intervention. They felt that conceiving naturally was emotionally or morally superior. Actually, in recent research, about 20% of patients get pregnant naturally after IVF, which is a surprising fact, coming from a physician treating fertility patients. One participant expressed powerful emotional distinction, saying, "Underneath, I have always perceived my child as different from normal children, a result of IVF, and as that embryo. So this time, I want to get pregnant normally and naturally." This reflects a subtle but meaningful stigma towards IVF, even among those who benefited from it. For some, their existing child felt emotionally distanced or marked by the artificial nature of their conception. Yet, even in these cases, the idea of discarding the embryo triggered guilt, leading them to reconsider the mottainai value of the embryo. Once again, debating whether to try for another child simply out of moral discomfort. So even when another child is undesired, mottainai, that power sense of waste, lingered and shaped their thinking. It was an ethical dilemma for many. So it's really a very burdensome process. And here's an example of those who was very hesitant to decide. It's improbable that I would receive an embryo transfer to have another child, but at the same time, seeing my child now, I feel resistant that a part of me, a child of mine, will be discarded by my word, discontinue. I feel as though I will be in this muddle forever. Among those who are hesitant, 2 key factors helped guide the decision to continue storage. They were able to persuade their partner to agree, emotionally and practically. Next slide. Persuade their partner emotionally and practically. And they were also comfortable covering the storage costs, which is about $500 or approximately 15,000 Taiwanese dollars for 3 years. So even without a clear plan to use the embryos, some couples choose to keep storing them simply because it allowed them to postpone the emotional burden of deciding. In the final stage of the decision-making process, highlighted in the pink, the patients who chose not to continue storage, to discontinue, face a deep moral challenge. What to do with the embryos they could no longer keep. Discarding the embryos outright was emotionally painful for all patients. largely because of their strong sense of mottainai, as I keep on saying, the feeling that discarding something valuable is wrong. So in many cases, the decision to discontinue storage was made reluctantly. It wasn't that they stopped caring about the embryos, it was that they were persuaded by their circumstances or their partners. Some were convinced that embryo transfer was no longer necessary or natural pregnancy would be a better path. They didn't necessarily want to discard the embryos, but they accepted it as a practical outcome. One patient said, "Really though, I'm sorry towards those embryos. I still want to keep them. My husband is ever more against me going through the IVF process though." This quote captures the tension. She feels a moral pull to keep the embryos, but her partner's strong opposition, possibly driven by emotional, financial, or physical concerns. In other cases, the partner was persuaded that having another child was simply not realistic, particularly due to the insufficient resources for child support. The prospect of parenting another child, especially with limited time, money, or energy, was enough to tip the balance. Japan is notorious for a high gender gap index, placing 118 out of 146 countries last year. And mothers in a household do more than 90% of the household work. So here, discontinued storage isn't a simple, purely rational act. It often involves emotional compromise, negotiation between partners, reluctantly letting go, deeply hold hopes or responsibility. In addition, they faced with a secondary emotional challenge, okay? Deciding between donating embryos to research or discarding them. So they consider effective donation. So the image of donation to research influenced this choice. One participant said, "It's a symbol of my hardship. It's a crystallization of my sweat, blood, and tears. I cannot just throw it away." Embryos weren't as just medical leftovers. They were an embodied result of a struggle, sacrifice, and hope that they wanted to give purpose with respect. Some patients chose to discard their embryos, not without emotional weight. They feared that research would harm the embryos or treat it disrespectfully. Others simply didn't trust what would be done with time, with the embryos after donation. So this is a quote from their partner. To them, discarding felt like a lesser harm, a way to avoid committing another evil deed against what they saw as mottainai embryo. For some, donating embryo to research was deeply symbolic. It was an expression of gratitude to IVF and a way to make amends for not giving birth to the embryo, a way to restore the life of the embryo, and a way of a sacrifice to the existing child. And this alleviated the guilt of discontinuing storage. And this is a quote of a patient who donated to research. So underneath, there was this theme, coming to terms with infertility. Every step from delaying the decision to weighing cost, partner input, or donation ultimately reflected how do I come to terms with infertility. Continuing storage meant postponing this acceptance. In contrast, discontinuing meant acceptance of infertility or emotional closure. For many patients, frozen embryos wasn't just medical, and they symbolized hope of being a normal woman who could still conceive. So receiving that letter was a painful moment, a reminder that time had run out. Letting go meant confronting not just infertility, but the stigma and the emotional loss behind it. So the real question became, can I accept this chapter is over? Okay. They postponed or denied acceptance of infertility, a lot of them, because they had difficulty in accepting the lifetime of infertility, and there was a inner shame associated with a disposal. And when, if they could postpone, then they felt relieved. And the acceptance of infertility was done in 3 ways. 1 was sublimation, 2, letting go, and 3, kuyo. Sublimation, donating became sublimation of guilt for not utilizing their mottainai embryo. And 2, letting go, discarding meant liberation from the entire infertility experience. And kuyo, a Buddhist memorial service for the dead and hard-worked entities. And I want to read this quote even though I'm out of time. I feel the need for a kuyo for those embryos, of course, but rather for myself to console the burden of having to receive infertility treatment and having to make this difficult decision. Conclusion, this model makes an empirical contribution to understanding patients deciding the fate of their embryos. So we've been talking a lot about embryos from a perspective of scientists and from a normative perspective, philosophical, but these are patients' experiences that I would like to share. Conclusion for Mrs. B. Mrs. B ended up using her embryo, continuing storage, and while she's very satisfied with her choice, she is very much burdened with childcare. And my research now goes beyond this, and I'm now doing an interview study with patients who transferred abnormal embryos because they could not discard them being labeled abnormal through genetic tests. I will be presenting the results in the next year, I hope. I'm done with the interviews, so thank you.